So good evening. It's a few minutes past 7 o'clock. We've got almost 120 attendees so far. I'm going to give it another second before we start in. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Josh Ginsberg, and I'm the president of the Carey Institute. Let's just give it till maybe 2 or 3 minutes past 7, and then we'll jump in. But I'd like to thank those of you who are already online for coming to our Carey Science Conversation, and really appreciate your signing up for this. We hope it's informative and a good use of your time. All right. So this evening, we're going to be talking about extreme heat, COVID-19, and equity in New York City. Give you a brief introduction to the Carey Institute, who we are and what we do. We're an independent research institute based about 100 miles north of New York City in the town of Millbrook, New York. We have 4 areas of scientific expertise. Well, we have many areas of expertise, but 4 areas of concentration: freshwater ecology, forest ecology, disease ecology, and urban ecology, despite being in a rural setting. We have worked across the country and across the world on urban ecological issues, and we are sort of combining 2 threads of our interest in disease and urban ecology tonight. The Carey Science Conversations have come about because of the pandemic. We've had a series in New York called Carey in the City at the Green Space, which is part of WNYC, and those were conversations as well. And we've had a series for almost a decade now at our headquarters in our auditorium in Millbrook called Friday Night at the Carey. But we're really excited about the Carey Science Conversations because we're drawing in a whole group of people who never heard of us and don't know anything about us. Our next Carey conversation is with one of the Carey scientists, Gary Lovett. Gary's a forest ecology who works on the diseases of trees, and he's going to speak about trees in trouble, closing the door on invasive forest pests. That's on July 23rd. So if you're interested, you can go to the website and sign up. You know, we try and make our seminars and our conversations timely. And sometimes our planning, and the planning for this conversation, it's going to be a live event in New York, but the planning started back in February. And some might think that the schedule of this evening's conversation, which looks at the nexus of climate change and environmental inequity and a global pandemic, was prescient, but that gets it wrong. These are issues that our panelists have been addressing and studying for many years. The global recognition of the convergence of social and environmental justice, a pandemic, and climate change activism is surely a long time coming. So we're up to about 160 people, and I'd like to thank you all for coming. Before we start, I'd really be interested if you could go to the chat and just answer 2 very quick questions. Do you live in a city? And we'll wait for that one. Hosts and panelists can't vote, so we're asking, do you live in a city? And then the second question, when this one is done, will pop up. And because we're expecting it to be a New York summer and a Northeast summer, we're going to be curious what you do to cool off in the summer. This summer is going to be a little harder to cool off because so many of the options are unavailable to us. So we'll let the poll run for a second. We're almost up to 170 attendees, and here's our results. So we've got a very urban crowd tonight, not a great surprise. About 85 people, or 60% of you are urbanites, and 33% are not. And the second poll is, what do you do to cool off in the summer? And I know that if you head to a beach, lake, river, or pool, it's a little more difficult, but it's my preferred way to cool off. So hopefully we can get people there. New York Public Library might be opening up soon. They're not sure. All right, while we're waiting for the results, why don't I start in on our introductions. Christian Brannian is a scientist and urban climate expert at NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies in New York City. I was talking to Christian before the talk, before we started, and I told him I hadn't realized that Goddard had a center in New York. He co-leads the Goddard Space Flight Center's Climate Environment Health Working Health Group, and he works with the Urban Climate Change Research Network, leading workshops to help use NASA datasets to enhance climate resiliency. Christian serves as the co-chair of the steering committee of the New York City panel on climate change. We have with us as well Emily Noble Maxwell. Emily is the director of the Nature Conservancy's Cities program and helped launch TNC's North American Cities Network. She too is based in New York. Emily is a prolific writer and has written a report called Building Capacity Through Diversity, which explores how diverse partnerships increase the efficacy of the environmental movement. And she also wrote a book called Urban Coastal Resilience, Valuing Nature's Role. We have as well Anel Hernandez. Anel is the Associate Director of the New York Environmental Justice Alliance. She works on city and statewide climate policy issues with a focus on local advocacy and research that moves forward equitable investments in coastal resiliency, green infrastructure, and renewable energy. Previously, she worked for the New York City Mayor's Office of Economic Opportunity and the Urban Climate Change Research Network at the Earth Institute at Columbia University. Anel is a member of Rachel's Network Rachel's Network Catalyst awardee. Rachel's Network is a group of very remarkable women in conservation. And she serves on the board of BK Rot, which I looked up, and it is New York's first community-supported, bike-powered, fossil-free food waste hauling and composting service. I wish I lived closer to Brooklyn. And she's on the board of the Newtown Creek Alliance. And finally, our last panelist tonight is Timon McPherson. Timon directs the New School's Urban Systems Laboratory, where he teaches urban resilience, systems thinking, and urban ecology. I am proud to say he is also a senior research fellow at Carey Institute and an associate research fellow at the Stockholm Resilience Center. Timon leads the National Science Foundation's the National Science Foundation's Urban Resilience to Extreme Weather Events Sustainability Research Network. And he is a member of the Urban Heat Island Task Force in the New York City's Mayor's Office for Recovery and Resilience, and recently joined Christian as a member of the steering committee of the New York City panel on climate change. So with 4 panelists, we have more structure than we've had in previous events, just to make sure we get through it. For the first half of the event, I'm going to tee off the panelists for each section. They're each going to give a short presentation, and I'll tee it off with a couple questions. And then they will share their screens and give some visuals. We're going to mute the large audience, but feel free to submit questions through the Q&A function, which we are now opening it up. Lori Quillen, the Director of Communications at Carey, will feed me those questions for the second half. Yes? Yeah. Pardon me, that's the alarm. Sorry, that's a child coming home and a dog barking.
So now we all feel like we're at home now. So.
Now we feel like we're at home. Anyway, so feel free to put questions in the Q&A, not the chat, the Q&A, and we will move forward. Anyway, let me start off, Christian, with a question. He's an urban climate scientist. So, of course, we would assume that he would know, or at least have a better idea than I might, whether we're going to have a heat wave this summer. And tied to that, I'm really curious, Christian, if you could talk to us a little bit about how COVID-19 might or might not be seasonal and how a heat wave would affect that. So let me hand over to Christian and say thank you very much. We're up to almost 200 attendees, and it's a great turnout on a beautiful summer evening. So thanks very much for coming.
Thank you so much for having me. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Wonderful. Let me just let me see if I can. Okay. Some of this thing will get a little smaller. So I'll attempt to answer those questions, and please let me know if I miss either of your questions. So again, my name is Christian Branion. I'm a scientist at NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies. here in New York, and I feel extremely privileged to be here with these esteemed panelists. I work along some really amazing folks at GIS, and I've learned quite a bit about helping cities use satellite data as well as climate projections to further their urban planning and their resiliency efforts. This is a map showing NASA Landsat data, and I'm really thankful to scientists like Stuart Gaffin, the late Stuart Gaffin, who guided me and helped me learn more about satellite technology. And of course, I have to be thankful to the pioneers around Landsat, pioneers such as Dr. Valerie Thomas, who's shown in the upper left-hand corner, who really paved the way in the late 70s and early 80s for us to be able to use satellite data to understand extreme heat. Extreme heat is a big concern for the New York community. New York City is a very densely populated city, and a city with so much impervious area, so many buildings and so much asphalt. This contributes to the urban heat island, which I'll talk about in a moment. We should note that there's lots of heat-related illnesses every year in New York. We're expecting this to be a fairly hot summer and a significant portion of the U.S. But here in New York, we should be particularly concerned because there's about 130 deaths each year here in New York, unfortunately associated with extreme heat. Extreme heat is kind of a silent killer in the United States. A lot of folks think that the deadliest weather hazard in the U.S. is flooding or perhaps storms, but in fact, extreme heat kills the most folks. We need to be particularly concerned here in New York because with climate change, we expect more frequent heat waves of longer duration. Just to touch a little bit about the urban heat island effect, I'm sure a lot of you guys are familiar with this. We typically will see higher air temperatures and even land surface temperatures in downtown areas and areas with lots of urbanization when we compare those areas with rural sites or sites with more vegetation. And this is because we've paved over all of the grass or much of the grass and vegetation, and it's not and a lot of the water bodies that were there before, particularly in New York, we had lots of creeks and streams. Those have now been paved over. The surface urban heat island varies when you compare night and day, and there's certainly a difference between surface temperature, the temperature of the ground in comparison to air temperature, but they both exhibit this urban heat island, and certainly surface temperature influences air temperature. When we think about the effects of heat on health, these are complex. A lot of times we just think about going outside and experiencing hot air, but humidity plays a significant role. That's why we use heat indices that incorporate both air temperature and humidity. And a big concern is folks that don't have air conditioning. Here we need to come up with strategies to ensure equity around health. And there's always this possibility of blackouts or brownouts because of the high electricity use that may accompany heat waves during the summertime. This can have influences on people's access to food and the food that's in their house. And particularly when we have a heat wave that lasts more than a couple of days, we're particularly concerned. Folks tend to die when you have 2 consecutive hot days with a nighttime period where temperatures don't get that low, and so folks aren't able to cool off during that nighttime period between the 2 consecutive hot days. Folks with air conditioning are particularly at risk in these cases, and certainly elderly folks and low-income folks are folks we need to be concerned about. In terms of heat projections for New York, we in the past we've typically seen 1 or 2 heat waves a year. When we think about the 1971 to 2000 period, we might have expected about 1 heat wave a year. What we're seeing for the 2020s is 2 to 4. We're at least projecting 2 to 4 heat waves a year, and by the 2050s, this could look like 3 to 5 heat waves a year. And we should note that these heat waves are going to get longer in duration. Where we've previously seen 4-day heat waves in the past. These may extend to 6 days, and on the high end, even 8 days in the 2020s in this decade. And certainly by the 2050s, we're looking at 5 to 9 day heat waves. So we certainly expect more hospitalizations and more deaths. And for this summer, we're concerned because we already have put a lot of stress on hospital systems. We've lost some healthcare workers, we've lost folks on the front lines. And when we think about the folks most vulnerable to heat waves and extreme heat, a lot of these folks on the front lines, beyond just the doctors, they may be the folks that are involved in the transit system, they may be our custodians, and these may be low-income folks and people of color. So we need to be particularly concerned about them this summer. In my work, I use satellite data, but I also use air temperature data. And I just want to highlight here that the value of satellite data. If you look at this figure on the right, the red spots indicate areas in New York with elevated surface temperature. And behind those red spots, you can see the heat vulnerability index for New York, with darker blue indicating higher heat vulnerability. And what you can see is that when we map land surface temperature, at least the hottest areas, these spots fall right on areas that have been identified by the city as heat vulnerable. And on the bottom left, you can see a plot that shows air temperature versus land surface temperature. The regression isn't as good as it could be because the air temperature data is associated with nighttime data. But you can see that there is some correlation there. And so we think that by using both air temperature and land surface temperature information, we can get a better sense for where we should target our interventions this summer. What we found is that places that have higher positive rates of COVID, often are also places with high heat vulnerability. This figure showing you the heat vulnerability index, the HVI that the city's developed, and there's significant overlap. Even though we don't always see overlap, we do see it in many cases. And so, as we think about the different modes of transmission, and we think about how to help folks stay cool this summer, an important thing to consider is that we're going to have to change our approaches to cooling folks off. There's that direct contact and indirect contact, but we need to be particularly careful about confined spaces where the droplets and aerosols that escape into the air when we speak and when we talk, when we sneeze and cough, how can we make sure that we keep folks cool in ways that don't involve confined spaces like cooling centers that have typically been used in the past. So we're evaluating public spaces, and a lot of times we'll think about vegetation, but we've got to also think about how much sun exposure there is. We've got to think about the time of the day. Shadows from adjacent buildings and shadows created by trees can be really helpful to help folks cool off. Sometimes we think that heat stress is only tied to air temperature, but it's also associated with that radiation that's radiated towards you from the ground and that's coming off buildings and walls and surfaces around you. And certainly humidity plays a role. So when we think about public space evaluation, when we think about programs like open streets that the city's developed, where they actually open streets and to allow more space for folks this summer, we really got to be cognizant that there's a complex evaluation involved, and I'm hoping to contribute to how the city evaluates the Open Streets program and other interventions this summer to keep folks cool, while managing social distancing. So a big question folks have, and I think this is the question that our moderator is getting at, is could there be seasonality, and why might hydrometeorology matter? And we think this is the case because we've observed seasonality with other human coronaviruses. But the question remains, which hydrometeorological factors play a big role. Recent research suggests that temperature and humidity could play a significant role. When we look at the cities that had some of the highest initial rates of death, we noticed that they tended to have lower humidity in March. And so we think that plays a significant role, but we need to collect more information. But we do know, from previous work looking at other coronaviruses and other diseases, that humidity does cause those droplets and aerosols to settle to the ground more quickly. Also, the viability of the virus goes down as humidity goes up. So we think humidity can play a role in managing the virus and the seasonality of the virus. Some folks have even suggested if we increase the humidity, in confined spaces, that could have benefits. Certainly, we know that improving ventilation will have benefits, so that's something to consider. So we're not exactly sure, but we're really focused right now on temperature, humidity, and we're even using ultraviolet radiation in some cases to sterilize spaces, for example, subways and trains. So what can the Earth observations community do? Well, scientists like myself at NASA and in other places, we really have to make our data more accessible, usable, and understood. That's part of the reason why I wanted to be part of this panel today and collaborate with these other professionals. We've got to collaborate with the public health community and disease transmission experts. I'm actually beginning conversations with hospital systems in New York and physician scientists. And so we've got to kind of stop working in such a siloed way and be more interdisciplinary. And we just have to communicate and think creatively. We haven't had a pandemic like this in essentially 100 years. So this is going to require novel solutions and new ideas. So thank you all, and I'll yield to the next panelist.
Great, and thank you, Christian. If you could unshare your screen, that will get us back. Wonderful. So that was great, Christian, and I really appreciate your answering my questions. I'm sure they're on the minds of others as well. Emily, I was wondering, your areas are environmental justice, green infrastructure, and I was wondering if you could sort of, following on Christian's discussion about temperature, humidity, the spatial distribution of heat islands, talk a little bit about the physical environment, heat and equity, and sort of amplify that, but also talk about how nature and nature-based solutions might connect heat and equity in New York City, because I think we tend to think of engineered solutions before we think of natural solutions. And I know that's an area you are an expert in. So if you could touch on that, that'd be great. And I'll hand over to you.
Absolutely. Just give me one moment to share my screen. Great. So, hi, and Josh, thank you so much for the warm welcome, and thank you so much to my fellow panelists and colleagues, Christian, Timon, Anel, for just having me on this panel. I'm really happy to be with all of you in the audience as well, and eager to get to the conversation. I'm Emily Noble Maxwell. I'm the director of the Cities program at the Nature Conservancy in New York. And the mission of the Nature Conservancy is to conserve the lands and waters on which all life depends. And I want to share with you, my presentation isn't going to touch on health heavily, but landscapes make our lives. And just today, I read an incredibly distressing and candidly enraging headline in the New York Times, and it was about a scientific study released very recently that said that pregnant women who are exposed to higher temperatures and air pollution are more likely to have children who are premature, underweight, or stillborn, and that African-American women and mothers and babies are harmed at a much higher rate than the general population. And so as I'm speaking, while I'm speaking about the landscape, I really want you to know that the landscape, it really makes our lives. And right now, when we think about both extreme heat and COVID, we need a few different attributes of our landscape. We need landscapes where people can go that encourage coolness and that really insulate and protect and shade where we live and work and play. But we also need places where we can safely socially distance. So I want to take you for a moment, and Christian did a wonderful job talking about the heat vulnerability index. I want to just take you through a bit of a landscape scale journey in New York City. And here we're looking at vegetative cover. Where we have the darker green, we have more vegetation, lighter is less, so that's pretty intuitive. And here we have temperature. And if we look back and forth, the darker purple is cooler, the sort of more yellow red is hotter. We can see a strong correlation between vegetation and cooler temperatures, which is really crucial to how we can think about our city overall and for places where people can be safer. We also can think about air pollution. And here again, where we see the very light or bright yellow colors, that's higher density of particulate matter, PM 2.5 specifically. Where it's darker purple, we have less. And again, we can see some real patterns in the data that correlate back to temperature, to vegetative cover, and also importantly to social vulnerability. And so where we see higher social vulnerability, we do see often higher air pollution, higher temperatures as well. But that's the conceptual. And now I want to take you down to what it feels like. And I want to take you on a bit of a journey just for a minute with me. And I want you to think about, on one of those sweltering, hot, humid New York City summer days, what it feels like to walk down a street that looks like this with limited shade, entirely hardscape, versus what it feels like to walk down this street with trees, shade, and some amount of permeable surface. And I think that you can imagine how those two might feel a good bit different. The Nature Conservancy, our city's program, we have two main areas of research and practice that I want to tell you about today that apply to the landscape as a whole. The first is roofs and the second is urban forest, and we'll talk about our city's rooftops first. So in New York City, we have about 1 million buildings. They comprise about 40,000 acres of land, which you can just think of that as an entire extra borough. That land, though, when we look at it, we wanted to take a look at how is it being used in order to help build the resilience of New York City to extreme heat and to flooding in a climate changing future. And so we looked for the first time at where there are green roofs in New York City and how many there are. And we did that in collaboration with others, including Timon from the New School. And why do we care about this? We care about this because green roofs insulate our buildings, help them stay cooler, help us use less energy. They absorb stormwater, they reduce air temperatures and air pollution, among other things. All of this critical in the climate changing world that Christian described, and in the urban heat island in which we are living as well. So when we did our first assessment of green roofs in New York City, we weren't surprised, but it's a bit shocking to know that as of 2016, in our 1 million buildings, we had only about 736 green roofs. So that's a really low number. We have a lot more potential. We also found that they're primarily on privately owned residential and institutional, and primarily in downtown Manhattan. So while this map looks like it has a lot of coverage, each dot is one roof. It's not acreage. And so less than 0.01% of all of New York City's rooftops have green roofs. And this has very meaningful implications for heat, as well as a number of other really critical social and physical issues in New York City. So if we look at a map side by side of our heat vulnerability index with green roofs, we can notice that our most heat vulnerable communities do tend to lack the feature of green roofs. There are a lot of reasons for that, which I can't go into today, but we can notice that, and we can see that as an area of opportunity. We can notice the same thing for social vulnerability. So where we have higher social vulnerability, we also have less green roofs. And it's critically important that as the city plans into its future, that we actually expand the asset of green roofs to maximize and capture all of the benefits that I described. In doing so, we do have to do it in ways that don't inadvertently have the unintended consequence of displacing people. So there are some issues with how that's done, but it's very important that the city does proceed to do that. Our urban forest is also an incredibly important asset. And when I speak of our urban forest, I speak of all of the trees in New York City. They cut across myriad landscape types and the physical and the social infrastructure that support them. So they really are a forest like any other. It's just a more highly fragmented and candidly stressed system. In New York City, we have approximately 7 million trees. Many of those are on our streets. About 22% of our land is covered by tree canopy. And again, it's spread across public and private land. It's in parkland, it's in street property, it's in people's homes, it's in schools. So it's not managed as a whole system. At the same time, trees provide a ton of value to New York City in terms of their sort of cash value, but also in the services that they provide: storing carbon, absorbing carbon, removing air pollution, reducing energy costs, and reducing runoff. But that is not necessarily the whole story, because that story is the whole city. And we want to think about equity, and equity is about the distributional sort of look at this asset. So first, I want to also mention that our urban forest is not a static system. It obviously, like all forests, change over time. And if we look at that system as a whole, we can look at canopy change, and we can understand using LiDAR data that there has been a change in tree canopy at the borough-wide scale that is generally what I would say a modestly increasing trend. So that's the good news. The less good news, and where you see the red and pink colors, we're seeing decreases, whereas the blue remains increases. The less good news is that this is heterogeneous, and that many of our neighborhoods and communities are actually facing losses. And that's an incredibly important thing to look at. To that end, I want to note here, and I know Anel is going to speak about this more deeply as well, that this is a snapshot of today. So where you see the darker green in the map on the left, we have a higher amount of canopy. Where you see the darker red, again, we have our heat vulnerability map that you all are going to be experts in by the end of this session, because you'll have seen it at quite a number of times. We can observe here that many of our most heat vulnerable neighborhoods do have lower canopy. And that's a real issue. It's also a real opportunity and a way that we can begin to help some communities address heat vulnerability, along with some really critical social programs that I think Anel will be speaking much more about. It's very important to know that resilience is both a physical process, and it's also a social process. And we need to have those two side by side. To that end, in collaboration with New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, we've collaboratively launched our Just Nature New York City partnership, which advocates more nature-based solutions, especially trees, across New York City to support climate justice and equity. And we see huge opportunities there based on the lack of equitable distribution now. But there are a lot of challenges that trees face. There isn't a constituency of powerful advocates. They're very disparately managed, and they're inequitably distributed. Many lack protection. Climate stressors are causing some decline and some challenges. And of course, the ongoing challenge of forest pests and pathogens. There's also budget challenges. Because of that lack of coordinated constituency, it is projected that the funding for New York City's trees will decline. And in fact, even this year, New York City's trees, under a COVID sort of strained budget, are facing significant loss in their maintenance, and there's also projected capital losses. So a lot of us are working hard to combat those losses and ensure that this system is funded as it should be. When I say a lot of us, we've recently launched a New York City Urban Forest Task Force. I won't read this whole list. There are many organizations ranging from environmental to community-based to environmental justice to real estate to health, and we've all come together to envision a healthy, biodiverse, robust, accessible, well-characterized, and resilient urban forest that justly and equitably delivers its multiple benefits to all residents of New York City. So I hope you all will stay tuned to learn more about what that task force does together. Collectively, though, I wanted to share, based on everything I've walked through with you, we do have some recommendations from the Nature Conservancy. We need to ensure rules and incentives to promote justice, equity, expansion, and better distribution of green roofs. We need to preserve and increase funds for urban forestry, both capital and operational. We need to advance and expand the Cool Neighborhoods and program, and Anel will speak more about that. And we also need to play fair for parks and make sure our parks are funded to ensure healthy green space and healthy places for social distancing and cooling this summer and into the future for our public parks. So with that, I really want to say thank you so much for having me. It's been great to be with you, and just to really remember that the landscapes we create really determine the lives that we live. Thanks so much.
Great, and thank you, Emily. That was really wonderful and meshed well with Christian's talk. I think when we get into the discussion, I'd be really interested in hearing about that economic and social trade-off, because clearly the services are phenomenal, but we don't capture their value very well in our budgeting and our investment. All right, to keep moving, I'd like to go on to Anel Hernandez from the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance. Anel, I think we've talked, and I was hoping you'd do a deeper dive on environmental justice issues in New York and how it relates to heat. and offer some insights on some of the things that your colleagues have already brought up.
Great, thank you so much. Thanks everyone for joining us this evening, and thank you to my fellow panelists. So I wanted to start off this evening by talking about who we are. The New York City Environmental Justice Alliance is a citywide membership network linking grassroots organizations from low-income communities and communities of color in our collective struggle for environmental justice. And here on the right, you see a map of all of our member organizations representing a variety of different neighborhoods in Brooklyn, Queens, Manhattan, and the Bronx. And we work together to deal with neighborhood-specific issues as well as together on citywide issues that impact all of the communities that we serve. So I wanted to start with some recent announcements made by both the mayor's office and state government. So our organization really sounded the alarm in terms of how extreme heat is going to impact us this summer and the compounding impacts with the COVID-19 pandemic. And we had a few demands that we made to make sure that vulnerable individuals and vulnerable community had access to some of the resources that they needed. And just recently, Mayor de Blasio announced a $55 million program to provide over 74,000 air conditioners to the city's poorest and most heat vulnerable New Yorkers, including folks living in public housing, as well as elderly people. In addition to that, we've seen the City Council introduce two critical pieces of legislation that will allow us to better track heat-related deaths and mortality in New York City and make that data publicly available. I think we've seen with the recent pandemic that having that information is really critical to understanding the risks that we're dealing with. We also have another piece of legislation to ensure that cooling centers are more comprehensive and are really meeting the needs. And this will bring us a little closer to where we need to be, but I think that there is still a lot to be done. And at the state level, the New York State Public Service Commission approved the city's request to provide additional financial assistance to make sure that people that are now using their ACs more are getting that summer utility bill assistance. We know that because of the New York pause policies, a lot of folks are out of work or in furlough. So, you know, these utility bills are yet another burden. So dealing with that is really important. And this is $70 million in aid that could provide much needed relief to about 440,000 families, providing up to $140 to meet those utility bill payments. And so I just wanted to also talk about our ongoing research. At the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, we've been really focused on this issue of extreme heat. You know, we often talk about hurricanes, but that's something that happens every few years, whereas extreme heat is something that's going to impact us every single year. And as Christian mentioned earlier, it's just going to get hotter and the heat waves are going to get longer. And so in our Climate Justice Agenda series, we really assess where the city and state are on a lot of their policies and make some recommendations to address that. And one of the things that we've highlighted is the particular vulnerability of public housing residents. As you can see here in the Heat Vulnerability Index, many of the most heat vulnerable communities are home to a lot of different public housing developments. And we need to make sure that as we're planning for heat mitigation in the long term, that we're also preparing and investing in community preparedness in the short term. We need to make sure that we have accurate data, that we have preparedness plans led by tenant associations, led by city agencies, led by community-based organizations. And here you have a list of some of the most heat vulnerable communities. As you can see, the majority of these are concentrated in central Brooklyn, in the South Bronx, and in northern Manhattan. And all of these communities are predominantly people of color, and many of them have very high rates of poverty. As you can see, about 25% of these communities are living below the poverty threshold. And having these programs that I mentioned are really important. And I just wanted to highlight one quickly. The Point CDC, one of our member organizations, leads the Be a Buddy program, where they try to create networks of people to support each other and just provide local information around how to beat the heat, how to stay cool. And these are the type of programs that we need to be investing in more so that we can deal with it in the short term. And as Emily mentioned, through our Just Nature NYC partnership, we recently released a fact sheet about the importance of our urban forest and how it can help improve community health. As folks have mentioned, trees have the ability to store and absorb carbon, driving down emissions, absorbing harmful co-pollutants coming from our industrial and fossil fuel and transportation industries. They can provide cooling by mitigating urban heat island through evapotranspiration and shading. And as Emily mentioned, we are not here for the defunding of more nature-based infrastructure. We need to make sure that we're not just maintaining our street, tree, and parks budget, but that we're expanding it. And again, I think this is the second time you've seen this, but here we have the comparison of tree canopy by community district, as well as the heat vulnerability index. And you can see that some of the most heat vulnerable communities are very much lacking a high percentage of tree canopy coverage. And here is another snapshot, just an example, Hunts Point, which is where the Point CDC I mentioned earlier is located, that has the Be a Buddy program. Their canopy coverage is about 8.4% compared to the citywide average of 22%. As well as Bushwick in North Brooklyn, 17% canopy coverage compared to the 22% citywide average. So we need to make sure that we're targeting these communities for investments. And one of the other intersections is air quality and our energy system. And I think Christian also talked a little bit about this earlier. As extreme heat continues to increase and we have hotter days for longer time, that's going to continue to put a strain on our energy system. And what that means is that when everybody's turning on their AC in New York City, there's the most polluting power plants that are called peaker plants and get turned on during peak demand, that really just exacerbate issues by spewing additional noxious carbon and co-pollutants in these same communities. And here you can see the locations of the peaker plants overlaid with heat vulnerability. And you can see in the South Bronx, for example, most heat vulnerable also has two power peaker plants located in that community. And again, there are compounding climate hazards that we're dealing with. As you can see here, many of the same communities are also at risk of storm surge and flooding. And that's really, really concerning because it's just putting multiple stressors on our community, but it's also highlighting yet another reason why we need to prioritize these areas. And just going deeper on that point, I wanted to focus a little bit on Bushwick and North Brooklyn. Here's just a few photographs of the community, just so it's not just maps. And I think I saw somebody asked if we still open fire hydrants. The answer is yes. I've enjoyed it in my childhood and still enjoy it sometimes today. But as you can see in North Brooklyn, we have a map here. The smaller dots that you see are the street trees, and the bigger dots are bioswales or rain gardens, which is an investment done by the New York City Department of Environmental Protection, aimed specifically at stormwater, but of course the co-benefits are also dealing with extreme heat. And from the other maps, this is one of the hotspots from the NASA data that shows high land surface temperature. And you can see that it's also very vulnerable to flooding, and it's an industrial area. So again, just another reason why we need to prioritize investments in these communities. And in the South Bronx, it's a similar story. We need nature-based infrastructure to deal with air quality issues, to deal with stormwater issues, to deal with waterfront access, to deal with extreme heat. And this is a report we put out in collaboration with Earth Economics to really understand the value of this infrastructure, specifically in Hunts Point. And I just wanted to end connecting all of this to the current crisis and highlighting that we have these fact sheets available on our website, connecting the issues of COVID-19 and environmental justice, COVID-19 and climate emergencies, and COVID-19 and a just recovery for New York City. And all of these nature-based investments is also a catalyst for new jobs. And I would love just to see that expand more toward this goal, this vision of integrated climate resiliency. So thank you so much, and I'll end there.
Great, and thank you very much. Really appreciate that, Anel. Brought home a lot of the points made by the two previous speakers and put them in a real life context. It looks like you have a remarkable network across the city, and I assume you're going to try and grow that a little bit?
Yes, but also making sure that we're doing the very deep, important, intentional work.
Yeah, and it looks like your network really does provide science and data, which is really remarkable. So thanks very much for that. All right, so that's the first three speakers. I will now introduce Timon McPherson from the New School and Carey Institute. Timon, your team both at Carey and at the Urban Labs has done a lot of work on environmental injustice of climate change impacts, and especially relating it to the heat vulnerable communities. I suspect we might see that heat risk map one last time. But I'm really interested in your sort of seeing, it's always both a blessing and a curse to go last. It's a blessing because you have the chance to sort of pull some together, and it's a curse because everybody else has made a lot of your points. But I trust you will be able to help us sort of better understand this. For the audience, I also just want to say the Q&A has been really active. And so we already have a lot of questions that have been answered. So go to the tab that says answered, and there are 10 questions answered there. And we'll have a few more questions at the end of Timon's talk. So Timon, I hand over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Josh. And here we go. So I would just want to thank Carey Institute for hosting this and pulling this all together. There's so much organization in the background that you can't see. And I also want to thank Christian and Anel and Emily for agreeing when I asked them to join the panel and talk about this. And as Josh said, they've already covered some really important range of the topics involving both COVID risks and heat risks and what we should be expecting and what we should be planning for. In the Urban Systems Lab and at the Carey Institute, where I've been working, there's some serious, I guess, concerns we've had about who's being most affected. And so some of the questions that we asked at the very beginning of COVID, back at the beginning of when this started occurring for us in New York in February, we started asking this question about who's vulnerable to COVID. And the reason we asked this question is because for the last 10 years, we've been doing work around looking at who has and does not have access to the benefits that nature provides, as Anel and Emily so well described. And we've also been working on climate resiliency and climate risk questions and asking who's most vulnerable to extreme weather events and what are the kinds of impacts we're seeing in New York City. And so at the end of February, we started asking this question: does all that work help us tell us anything about what to expect in terms of COVID impacts and COVID risks? And so I want to talk a little bit about some of the things that we've been observing that I'm sure you've been reading in the papers. We asked some questions. First, who's most vulnerable to the direct health impacts of COVID, with this sort of guiding hypothesis that it's probably going to be people who've been experiencing these extreme weather events, flooding and heat impacts that Anel was just talking about. Then we wanted to ask another question. This is really what I want to try to get to a little bit and then open it up for some discussion, is as we respond to the COVID crisis, and we are definitely in the middle of this crisis, will that create additional risks? So first, are there overlaps between the risks that people are facing and the impacts of COVID and heat and other kinds of weather extremes? And is the response to one actually potentially creating additional risks to another. And if you want to find out some more about this work, you can check our COVID-19 page at the Urban Systems Lab, and you'll be able to find out much more. I'm just going to cover a few key points. So like I said, when we first started looking at this, and this is very recent data of confirmed cases in New York, which I suspect that everyone is seeing maps like this. There's two circles here I want you to follow. And they'll refer to these in the chart already in terms of some of the most affected areas in New York City, in northern Manhattan, in the South Bronx, and northern Bronx as well, and parts of Flushing and parts of Queens. These are areas with very high number of COVID cases. And so again, our question was, is the information that we probably all know, but I want to make a little bit more explicit here, of the way in which we've designed our cities, as Christian was talking about, to trap heat, and the way in which we've built in structural racism into the way in which we planned, governed, and built our city, so that the communities of color and the low-income communities are the ones that are facing the brunt of those heat impacts, the ones that don't have as much access to trees and other kinds of green infrastructure to cool off the city. Are those drivers also driving exposure to COVID? And we can't answer this fully, but I certainly want to show you some patterns we've been seeing. For example, who doesn't have health insurance in New York? Millions. It's so many people. It's incredible how many people do not have health insurance. And if you look on the map on the right, the dark areas are the places that have these high concentrations of people who don't have access to health insurance. On the left is a graph. The trend line here that sort of goes a little bit towards the positives is basically the percent of the population that doesn't have health insurance on the bottom, and on the vertical axis is the percent of positive cases. So as you have more people without health insurance, you have more cases of COVID being tracked. If you look at it from a race perspective, we see that it's maybe it's not surprising, but it is certainly horrible that we're seeing this repeated pattern of people of color facing the most extreme impacts of heat, the most extreme impacts of flooding, and the most extreme impacts of COVID-19. Here you see this very strong trend, because as you move to a community that's essentially more colorful, it becomes a place that has higher case rates. And there's been a lot of important news made about this. We've been providing the analysis to make this extremely clear, I hope. And I think this is one of those moments, and we're seeing this in lots of other movements and social protest for very good reason, to not only highlight these kinds of patterns that we're seeing, but highlight the structures that have been in place for 400 years in the United States and in New York in particular, that have driven us to have a map like this and to have a trend like this. What about the economic impacts? Those are direct health impacts of COVID, right? If we look at economic impacts, here is a map of communities that have high rental displacement, people being pushed out of their homes. And this is data for the last couple years. But again, somewhat surprisingly in a way, and yet if you think about it, not so surprising, because of the way in which these variables are related to each other. You see that the communities that have high eviction rates, people being pushed out of their homes over the last many years, are the places with the highest cases of COVID. So what I'm really trying to get at is that there is overlap between all the maps that I could have shown you for the work that we and many others have been doing for many years, that show that communities of color and low-income communities in New York are the ones facing climate change risk and the impacts of current extreme events that we've seen in the past, and will likely see, whether it's this summer, perhaps, and definitely in the coming years, as Christian was talking about. Those are the same communities that are overlapping in the impacts of COVID. So in this case, it goes on. There's many more maps like this I could show you, but I just want to sort of emphasize this now, the sort of reverse trend on the left. The lower income levels are the ones with the highest rates. And again, you're seeing these areas, northern Manhattan, South Bronx, these parts of Queens, places where you have low income and communities of color facing the highest impacts of COVID. So, you know, the point I'm trying to make here is that there are fundamental systemic drivers that are behind the patterns that we're seeing, and the patterns are not coincidental, right? The fact that we're seeing the same communities impacted by COVID as the ones that are impacted by climate extremes and weather extremes is a function, as Emily was saying, of the landscape we live in. In fact, it's not hyperbole to say that it's the neighborhood and it's the structures that have created these neighborhoods, the designs, the plans, the ways in which we're going to have to shift our city if we want to do better than this. And I think we do. And people are out on the streets demanding that we do, then we are going to have to redesign our city. We're going to have to retrofit our city. We're going to have to plant the trees and the green roofs in the neighborhoods and do that in a way that also addresses issues of job security, of available low-income housing, and the things that must be bundled together to address the structures behind the patterns that we're seeing here. So those are the overlapping layers, right? That's the COVID impacts that we're seeing. And if you go back to the mini maps you've seen in terms of where you see the hot areas in the city, then you see these same communities are red, right? These are the same communities we've been talking about all along. And not just them, it's not to leave out other communities, but I want to focus your attention so you can see the patterns and how pervasive they are. It's also an issue of how we deal with this. I think one of the amazing things that was just announced in the last week that Anel was just talking about is that for a decade or more, many people have been advocating for the city to subsidize air conditioning for the low income who can't afford them. And this is happening, and my hope is that we can find a way to make this permanent, that every summer, people who don't have air conditioning can get access to that during these high heat events and have a way to cope during that strategy. As a long-term sustainability strategy, there's some issues with relying on window box air conditioners, but I think this is a step in the right direction for the city to acknowledge those who are in need and to do something about it. And all the people who've worked so hard on this, I think, deserve some massive applause. One thing I just want to point out, if you go back to 1852 in the New York Times, before it was even the New York Times, it was the New York Daily Times. In almost 170 years, we haven't made that much progress on how we design our cities. Here in the newspaper, they're describing how hot it is, the urban heat island effect, 168 years ago in New York City, and we're still dealing with this problem. And I think now is the time for us to make a fundamental transformation, a fundamental shift in the way we design our cities. And I think that's actually what Anel and Emily in particular were talking about when they're saying we can't just maintain our canopy. We need a fundamentally different city here. And I think we have to finally say we're not just repeating the status quo of the structures that cause these kinds of racist impacts and the structures that cause heat to be trapped and certain people to be more exposed than others. So I'm going to move towards the end, which is really to look at interdependency, because one of the things we're also seeing is, of course, we've flattened the curve in New York on COVID. It took a while. It didn't happen fast enough. A lot of communities suffered, but we have done that. And we've done that because there's been so many social distancing policies put into place. But the question now, as we move into the hot summer, as we move into the hurricane season, is whether or not these kinds of policies will backfire in some ways in terms of how that changes the behavior in the city, right? So if you look at Twitter data, for example, we see it's been working. This is just from the April slot, but you can see that most people have either been in their homes or out in green and open space. And this green and open space has been so crucial during COVID for people to be able to get out of their apartments, to be able to deal with the isolation, the physical and social isolation. And yet, as the COVID crisis turns into the economic crisis, we see the fear and actually, you know, the real challenge of budgets being slashed and park budgets being slashed because there's inadequate funding available right exactly when we need them. I'm going to move a little bit quickly so we can get to questions, but one of the things we've done in the Urban Systems Lab, partnered with the Nature Conservancy and Emily's group, also the Building Healthy Communities initiative in New York, and New York State Health Foundation, is to launch a survey to understand how are New Yorkers using parks. And if you're interested in taking this, you can go to our website and click on the survey for New York and take it right now. But I'll just show you some preliminary data. We just crunched these numbers last night. One of the things we found, and this is hopefully supports the points that the other panelists have been making, is that during COVID, in fact, absolutely, people are increasing their use of park and open space, and for all sorts of reasons. But I'll show you three really fast. One is mental health. 69% of 1,300 responses we have so far have said it's extremely important, parks and open space, for their mental health. And if you look at the rest of that number, that's 90% are very or extremely important for their mental health. This is exactly the kind of thing Josh was just talking about that is not well captured in our economic models for how we value parks and how much money we should be spending to support, build, expand, and do that equitably in New York City. Physical health, here similar, about 80% say that it's very or extremely important for their physical health. And we think about it from the stress that we are all under during this extremely stressful time, not all under it equally, we might add. Here too, we're looking at almost 80% are saying that it greatly or somewhat decreased their stress level to be able to go into a park or an open space. And we're looking forward to sharing much more results of this. But my point here is that the social distancing policies have other impacts. And one of them is that it means that our parks and open space are more important than they ever have been, perhaps, and need more investment, not less investment. The last point is about how does social distancing policy create interdependent risk? And so this question here, I think, is not only for this moment, it's about a larger moment of how do we rethink resiliency planning? How do we rethink the design of our city in ways that address the structures, that really address those structures that have been in place for hundreds of years and shift us fundamentally, but also do it in a new normal in the context of multi-hazard risk, the risk of pandemic on top of the risk from heat waves, potentially risk from other kinds of storms. So here's where we are right now in 2020. It's a warm year. This is what the data looks like in this part of the globe. If you look at the little globe there, you can see this is the southeast of the United States. And what this means, this warm sea surface temperature, is that the chance for having a hot summer is pretty high. And the chance for having a strong hurricane season is pretty high. And so this means that it's not only heat we have to worry about in these neighborhoods and other parts of the city, it's also extreme rainfall, it's also storms. We have to start rethinking the way we work in this city at all levels, but in a multi-hazard risk framework. And I think the pandemic is one where this is perhaps more visible than it ever has been. So I'm gonna just stop and say that I've showed some information from a number of other amazing scholars in the lab and at the Carey Institute that I wanna thank, and I will stop there. I look forward to questions and discussion.
Great. Okay, I'm not frozen. Yay. So if the panelists could come back on, that'd be great. I'll thank, we've had 28 questions, 20 of which have already been answered. There was one question in the answered question that has several pieces to it, but let me just phrase it this way. We've talked about New York City. Somebody asked about Boston. Are these patterns that we're seeing in New York, if not universal, at least common across the states and in other countries? Or is New York, for some reason, particularly bad at handling heat and equity issues? And anyone can jump in, please.
I'll take on one piece of it and I'll let my co-panelists take on another. So one commonality is many cities across the United States and globally are seeing tree canopy loss. And I think that is something to really pay attention to, because there are a number of drivers, from development pressure to lack of protections, and that then coincides with some of the other issues that we're seeing.
Yeah, this is Christian Brannion. Thank you for that comment, Emily. I've observed this phenomenon in other places also. I was in Tel Aviv, Yaffo, Israel, last year, and they're experiencing some serious urban heat island issues. And like New York, they've locked themselves into quite a bit of development around impervious area and concrete and asphalt. And they also have equity issues with a significantly large immigrant community. I was surprised by how many folks from East Africa that were there. And I think this is just a common thread in different societies, that low-income folks and other marginalized communities suffer the brunt of this type of thing.
Maybe I'll just add a quick point, Josh, because it relates to the Carey Institute. There's a paper that should be out very soon by some of the colleagues that have been affiliated with the Carey Institute for some time. And what that will show is that nationally in the United States, there's a very strong overlap in cities all across the US between places that have low tree cover, places that have high heat, and places that have low income communities of color. And so just to anchor what everyone has said is there's also excellent data showing that this is a national trend in US cities for sure. And as Christian said, it's not only US cities.
And just one more thing to add, I don't know why it didn't occur to me, but Vivek Chandas and other scholars have pointed out that there's significant correlation between hotspots and redlining. So essentially historical practices associated with structural racism can clearly be tied to where we have the hottest land surface temperatures and air temperatures in cities. So this is something systemic that it's gonna take some vision to address. And I think our panelists have hit on, we've got to rethink how we build cities and how we change the built environment.
Which actually would be lead me into another question that again, I'm trying to synthesize 3 or 4 questions. People talked about mega blocks and reducing traffic and increasing open space, which would give us more space to plant. That might also need us to change transport, change housing patterns. Are we at a point, do you think, where the convergence of COVID, the convergence of the pandemic with the real what looks to be a pivot point in our recognition of environmental justice and social injustices and institutionalized racism, do you think we're at a pivot point where we might actually be able to get more radical approaches to redesigning the city, or do you think that's just an environmentalist night dream, sort of dream? Anel, why don't you grab that one first? I see you moving forward.
Yeah, I think I'll use something that I often think about when I envision what Brooklyn can look like in the future. In addition to all of the factors that you mentioned, we also have some of the most groundbreaking climate policy that was passed last year in New York City and New York State. And so what that means is that by 2040, we have to have a carbon-free electricity sector. And by 2050, we're supposed to be carbon neutral across all sectors: transportation, energy, waste, all of it. And so what does that mean? For our industrial waterfronts, where all of this very noxious and fossil fuel-based infrastructure has been sited and disproportionately impacted low-income communities and communities of color, now these areas can become hubs for not just a renewable energy future, but also a regenerative and nature-based future. And so I think about Newtown Creek in specific, which is the border of Brooklyn and Queens, and as we saw in the slides earlier, one of the hotspots for heat, very vulnerable to flooding, location of a lot of industrial facilities. And that area can be re-envisioned. What do the shorelines look like? What are the industries that are there? Can that become a hub for nature-based infrastructure and maintenance and all of that? So that's what I think. That's just one example that I always envision.
Anyone else?
So I'm going to build on it, and funnily enough, I think I'm going to quote Anel from a conversation we were having just a few days ago about re-envisioning our city's tree canopy. And, in some ways, the question is an overwhelming question on one level. And then when I sit back, what I see is we have a really interesting constellation of panelists from different sectors who haven't historically always worked together. And I think that the future that you're talking about, Josh, requires groups with different skills, different strengths, different assets to actually collaborate well together, which takes time and effort. And the thing, Anel, that you had said that has really been ringing in my ear is it is our job, and I would suggest it's the job of all of us who are on the panel today, to make the aspirational realistic. And I think that's a really powerful thing to think about. How do we take that vision and really translate it for other people into ways that we make feasible this future?
Yeah, I'll add one thing. I know that my colleagues on the New York City panel on climate change are thinking about this. It's really tough for humans to make decisions that may affect people that they've never met and that people that will come after them. Folks may not even always look out for neighbors that they don't know. But what we've seen a lot is a lot of social resiliency in New York, where neighbors are checking on other neighbors and folks are making sacrifices to make sure others are safe. One thing that I'm encouraging my colleagues to do is to help the city think about short-term, medium-term, and long-term planning. And I anticipate with the next assessment report that we'll actually lay out some guidance for imagining a resilient future on multiple time scales, so that we're not just focused on this year, next year, or the next coming few years.
And we got a question that actually follows beautifully on this, and Anel particularly. You talk about transformation of the waterfronts and the industrial waterfronts, particularly in Queens, the Bronx, and Brooklyn. Manhattan, they've already been gentrified. And the question was, as we start doing this, are we worried about the impact on low-income communities that have been impacted by redlining and zoning decisions and all this, and all of a sudden these areas with waterfront become cleaner and healthier? And how are we going to deal with the issues of gentrification and displacement?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. I think, there was something that I heard somebody say a while back that really struck me. In the neighborhood I live in Bushwick, there tends to be trash everywhere, in our green spaces everywhere. But if that issue is dealt with, if the Department of Sanitation actually addressed this issue in our community, then would that push us out, right? And it's like, oh, would we prefer to keep the garbage so that we can keep our community? That's such a messed up way to think about it, but that's literally where we've gotten to, because gentrification is just as big of a risk as pollution, as climate change, as all of this, because that's where we live, that's our livelihood, that's our family. So it's a difficult question, and it has to be something that comes from the housing advocates as well. I think they have a really strong network, and they've achieved so much last year as well with the huge rent laws that were passed. And it's also making sure that when we're creating these programs for climate change, for energy, that equity issue is built into it from the beginning. And just one example, the energy efficiency mandate that was passed in New York City, that was really important. But the last thing that we wanted to do is require energy efficiency upgrades that would then increase rents and then displace people. So we dealt with that up front. We tried to, provide different pathways, and hopefully, that will be better addressed with the recent state laws that were passed. But similarly, we need to make sure that we're creating incentives for people that are already living in their community.
I think that's a good summary of, as you said, an extremely complicated question that deals with historical disinvestment, deals with the location of housing versus industrial spaces, and the decapitalization of the poor in New York City. So, Timon, you want to jump in?
I just want to add to that and just pick up on it, because I think something Emily is saying about the way in which people like us haven't historically, these institutions, these groups work together, and we are now, is positive. But I think there's also a sort of system state change that's required that we haven't done yet. And by that I mean, and it's what I was trying to sort of hint at in terms of, if we're going to plant trees in a neighborhood, we need to be also simultaneously working on expanding low-income housing and finding more job security and energy security, right? It's this challenge of how do you do everything at once? Because if you don't, you end up with these unintended consequences, and it seems impossible to do that. But that's because the structures we have for decision-making, the structures we have for budget allocation are very siloed. And so I think there's some fundamental shifts in the government apparatus and the decision-making apparatus that builds on what Emily was talking about, that says, okay, we're around the table talking to each other now. Now, how do we start to actually change the nature of the system that makes decisions that I think a lot of people have very good intentions of and are trying to do the right thing in terms of improving justice and equity and climate resiliency in the city. But it's difficult because we haven't quite fundamentally changed in a way that allows us to allocate funding for, say, a tree planting program and affordable housing and work on other kinds of rules and zoning and stuff in that neighborhood in a particular place at the same time. And we've got to get to that point because as Anel said, this is really tough to solve, and it's especially tough to solve in the way we're still relying on a 20th century model of governance.
Great. We are coming.
You're muted, Josh.
I clicked on it, but it didn't unmute. Thank you, Timon. We're coming up on an hour and 20 minutes of presentations and conversations. We still have 170 participants, 163 attendees. We peaked at just over 200, so people are hanging in there. So let's just do a couple more questions, and then I'll thank the attendees for coming. I'll thank the Carey Institute staff for organizing this and doing such a great job, and I'll thank the panelists at the end. One of the people asked, we've talked about green roofs, we've talked about trees, we've talked about parks. Are there other things we can do to structures to change them? And I'm going to pull in a second question here, in terms of changing their color, changing their structure, because a lot of the buildings we have are buildings that we are likely to have, given how slowly things change in New York, for 30, 50, 70 years.
I'm happy to jump in. I'd love to hear from my fellow panelists. The answer is absolutely. As a representative of the Nature Conservancy, many of the solutions we often speak about are nature-based, but a really efficient way to cool our buildings is a program called Cool Roofs, right? So that's effectively putting a light-colored coating to increase reflectivity and stop the absorption of heat. So that's something that continues to be invested in by the city. We think it should be invested in, more and more. Not all buildings are prepared structurally to have a green roof. We can't have a future where every building has one, but we can have a future where all of our roofs are really providing more services and less disservices. So I think that's one really prime example. I'd also cite that as we convert, and I'd really hand it off to Anel, who's more of an expert in energy issues than I am, but as we convert from more fossil fuel based economy really to a climate friendlier economy, that's going to go a long way towards helping with air pollution issues and other cooling issues.
Now you want to jump in?
I'm not sure I caught the tail end of that question. Oh.
You're muted again, Josh.
Oh, God. Sorry.
Right.
What can we do other than the things we've discussed in terms of energy transition and green roofs and plantings? What are the things we can do for the built environment that will help address these issues?
I think one thing that we haven't mentioned, though it might have been implied, is community gardens. I think that it's a really important community space with a lot of community autonomy, and we've lost a lot of those over the last decade. And those are really important to also build networks of community resiliency. It's not just infrastructure, and folks have already mentioned this, is not just infrastructure in the short term or long term, it's also making sure that we have these networks of social cohesion, that we have these networks of mutual aid, these networks of community support. So that's a really important piece of it as well.
This is Christian Branion. I'd add that we're going to have to be creative about how we create shade in cities. Especially a city like New York, where many of the buildings have already been constructed that will be constructed in the coming decades. So use of awnings to create shade when possible, and just fundamentally thinking differently about how we lay out the city and where we expand to. In a city like this that has inland flooding, I think there's a place for us to capture some of that water and maybe create public spaces, small ponds and small lakes that could have, significant cooling benefits after a cloud burst, after a storm event. We've started doing some of this in terms of green infrastructure, but I think there's a space for more of this and just a rethinking of anticipating inland flooding, anticipating cloud bursts and rain events and coastal flooding, and using that water as a means for cooling. Just a few thoughts.
Great. Thanks,
If I
Simon.
could just add to it, Josh, I think what you're getting at, though, is that we're not going to solve the climate challenge in New York City with only nature-based solutions. And you know, one could imagine a very sort of extreme, and I love to imagine this, a New York that is so green that it's a fundamentally different city, right? It's not the one that's written about in the books and fiction and everything, right? And I'd like to imagine that. But given the power of climate change on the planet and the way it's going to impact us regionally, we're not going to solve it just with that. So we have to think about the hybrid solutions and a bundled set of solutions. So there's a number of things that we could be doing that haven't been mentioned yet, I think, like, for example, insulating buildings better, right? One of the main challenges, a lot of us work on greening the exterior environment, but we have to green the interior environment. And part of the ways we can do that, and this goes to some of Anel's points about the sort of net zero kinds of approaches in the city that are focused on climate mitigation as a driver, will also have climate adaptation benefits. Because if we can, on the one hand, retrofit buildings and insulate them, then there's less solar radiation coming in that Christian was talking about in the very beginning, that's exposing people during days and nights inside their apartments. So that's one way to keep the heat from coming in, right? And then additionally, there's this strong impact that both Anel and Christian were getting at between air pollution and heat, right? Our exposure to temperature and the way it affects us physically is also dependent on the way in which it's amplified by air pollution. So if we're on a net zero approach and we're working towards an energy transition, that should also have benefits in terms of decreasing air pollution. And there's a number of things the city has done in terms of, you know, changing the fuel oil sources for heating and cooling to start to get at that. So I think these are the kinds of things we need to be doing simultaneously. And in some ways, New York is a leader in a number of initiatives. And I think there's some things we can feel very proud of. And at the same time, it's clear from everything we've talked about, there's quite a bit of work left to do.
So unless any of you, if you have final words you'd like to say, raise your hand. I really can't tell you how much I appreciate all four of you coming on tonight. We have had a diversity of backgrounds, ideas, and experiences, but I think the one thing that comes really clear through this process is that we have to do better at talking with each other and getting a diversity of people together to solve these problems. They are all interrelated and integrated, and the solutions will need to be as well. So thank you so much to the 159 of you who hung out to the bitter end. I can't tell you how grateful I am. This has been one of the silver linings of the last 4 months has been we've been able to reach out to a whole new audience, and a more urban audience and a more global audience. We will be posting this on our website, and we'll send out links to all the people who signed up. In addition to which, we'll put in the Q&As and the answers so that if we missed questions that you posed, we'll try and get an answer to them and get them up on the website. I wish you all a wonderful evening, and stay safe and stay cool. So good night, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Josh. And thanks, Anel, Emily, and Christian. Really wonderful.
Right. Thank you, everyone.
Everybody.
Thank you so much.
Everyone.